man in our image, in our likeness, and let them rule over the fish of the sea, over the birds of the sky, over the cattle, and over all the earth, and over all the creeping things that creep on the earth. And God created man in his own image. In the image of God he created him. Male and female, he created them. I like to do that in cadence because I feel like God was saying, 8 times God says, I made the cattle, the birds after their kind, the cattle after their kind, the creeping things after their kind, and 8 times God says, let us make these things after our kind. And then he gets to you, and he says, let us make man in our image. The connotation is, let us make man after our kind.
Yeah.
And God made you after the God kind.
Yeah.
You weren't an amoeba that warped into an ape that warped in. You were made in the image of God, in the likeness of God. And you were actually made like God. Ephesians chapter 5, verse 1 says, be imitators of God. How many understand when you're acting like God, you're being yourself? Because you were made in the image and likeness of God. And I love this part. It says that he gave us power over all the birds of the sky, the cattle, and over everything that creeps on the earth. How many of you know, ladies, you have power over creeps? I don't know if you knew that. You have power over creeps. I've been practicing with, the birds, like at home, I'm like, this is a no poop zone. I do this over my car. No poop zone. I'm just practicing dominion over the birds. And so we were made after the God kind. Verse 28, God blessed them and said, be fruitful, multiply, and subdue the earth. And obviously, the first point I'd like to make in this conference really is that God made you after his kind, and God made Adam. The word Adam and the word man, Hebrew word, it's the same exact word. He made Adam both male and female, as you know. How many know God's not a man?
Right. That's right.
God's both male and female, and if you oppress women, then you reduce the revelation of God by 50%.
Wow.
Because God's not a man. It took a man and a woman to demonstrate the revelation of who God is.
Yep. Very good.
And so in Genesis chapter 2, we see God now talking about how he actually made man. Verse 7, then the Lord God formed man from dust of the ground. He breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and man became a living being. And the Lord planted a garden east of Eden, where he placed the man whom he had formed. Verse 19. Then the Lord God said, it's not good for man to be alone. I will make him a helper suitable for him. And out of the ground, the Lord God formed every beast of the field, every bird of the sky, and brought them to the man to see what he'd call them. And whatever he called the living creature, that was its name. And the man gave names to the cattle, to the birds, to the sky, to every beast of the field. But for Adam, there was not found a suitable helper. I wish I had a lot more time to do this part, but I do want to touch on it. Isn't it interesting that Genesis 1, God said, let us make man in our image, male and female, he made them. And then chapter 2, which most of us believe that chapter 2 is, chapter 1 is God giving an overview. Day 1, I did this. Day 2, I did this. Day 3, I did this. All the way down to, day 6 to day 7, God rested. And then day 2, God seems to say, okay, let me just go back and tell you exactly how I did this. I started with man. I brought him from dirt, breathed into him. How many know God created man and he created the animals from dirt?
Right.
He breathed into man. It's the reason why your DNA is so close to every other creature on the earth, because God used the same raw materials. But when he created man, he breathed his spirit into man. He never did that to an animal. I like my puppy, but he's not a Christian. And then but then we have an interesting dynamic here that I don't know if you've thought through. And I didn't think through it too much until I started writing the book. We see Adam alone in the garden. And God begins to say, and God says, it's not good for Adam to be alone. And we're like, all right, that's easy to understand. It's not good for man to be alone. I'll create a suitable helper for him. And we'll talk about the word helper in a minute. And God begins to create creatures that Adam names. Now you can imagine that this was probably a long process because there's a lot of creatures, right? A couple of things I want to point out here. Did you notice that by the 6th day, God stopped talking? Like God did not speak the creatures into being. He did not speak Adam into being. He literally molded them from dirt. I'm simply saying that sometimes when God's silent, he's doing his best work.
Wow.
And so God begins to form creatures from the dirt, and he passes them by Adam. And I'd like to suggest to you that when Adam's calling the creatures names, that he's not calling them like Spot, Fifi, and Trigger. But that literally Adam, and the connotation in the Hebrew is that Adam is calling them names. He is actually procreating with God. He's actually prophesying their divine destiny, and it says, and whenever Adam called them, that was their name. In other words, Adam was actually, when Adam said, and obviously this is before there was languages, who knows what kind of language Adam spoke, but let's say that Adam sees the creature that God formed, and Adam goes, lion. And when Adam says lion, suddenly that creature takes on the dynamics of a lion. Are you with me?
Yeah.
So Adam is procreating with God. God was silent, so therefore it gave room for Adam to speak.
Yeah.
And Adam began to speak. Now, there's an interesting dynamic here, because if Adam was all by himself, then we have a real problem with Genesis 1, because the first commandment to Adam was to be fruitful and multiply. Secondly, if God was looking for a woman, if God was looking for someone to procreate with Adam, I'll be careful how we say this here, but it's kind of weird that God would make creatures for Adam to procreate with. Because you'll notice that 8 times God says he made everything after his kind. In other words, the birds can't mate with the dogs can't mate with the horses.
Right.
I'm simply saying God said, listen, there's interspecies evolution in the sense that things change, but a cat doesn't become a dog.
Right. Yeah.
Are you following me?
Yep.
So I'm just saying from a scientific approach, God couldn't have been saying to Adam, well, let's see if we can find someone for you to procreate with. Because remember, God only procreates after their kind.
Yeah.
Are you following me?
Yes.
So I'm saying, so what was God doing when God said to Adam, let's see if we can find a helper, and he runs animals by them? Have you ever thought through this? If Adam is all alone, is God trying to find a mate in another creature? That doesn't make sense, and it breaks Genesis 1.
Right.
I'd like to suggest that Adam wasn't alone in the sense that there was no other Adams around, but that he was lonely. Follow me for a minute. I'm saying that God wasn't looking for someone for Adam to procreate with. God was looking for somebody to solve his loneliness with. Because Adam was made with a God hole.
Yep.
And God came in the cool of the garden. In other words, when God was gone, Adam was alone. He didn't have anybody he related to like he related to God.
Yeah. Wow.
So what does God do about that? God puts Adam to sleep. You'll notice in verse 21 of chapter 2. So the Lord God caused a deep sleep to fall upon man, and he slept, and God took one of his ribs and closed up his flesh there. And the Lord God fashioned into a woman the rib which he had taken from the man. And God brought her to the man, and the man said, this is now bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. She shall be called woman, because she was taken out of the man.
Yep.
Where was the woman?
In the man.
He was taken out of the man. The woman was in the man.
Yeah. Yeah.
For, if there was a few men, there's a few men in here. You can't get in touch with your feminine side because you don't have one. The woman was taken out of the man. So where was the woman? She was in the man. So God took Adam and said, okay, here's how I'm going to make sure you no longer feel lonely. I'm going to take you and I'm going to break you in half. I'm going to take the feminine side of you and I'm going to remove it from you. And when Adam woke up, I'd like to suggest that he immediately knew that something was missing, because he was both male and female at one point. How do we know that? Because the woman was taken out of the man.
Right.
I'd like to suggest that Genesis 1, female, is not the Genesis 2 woman. That Adam was both male and female, and the woman was taken out of the man, so now Adam needs the woman the same way he needs God. He's not complete without her.
Wow.
And when Adam wakes up, he realizes that half of him is missing. And he looks up, and I know there's lots of humor we can do right now, but for the sake of time, I won't be funny. He wakes up, he looks at the woman, and he sees what he's missing.
Wow.
I'm saying he sees what he's missing because he used to have it.
Wow.
And immediately he goes, this is bone of my bone, flesh of my flesh.
Wow.
She shall be called woman because she's taken out of man. And then he begins to prophesy to her. How do we know it's a prophecy? Because he says, and a man shall leave his father and mother. How many know Adam didn't have a father and mother? He only had dirt. A man shall leave his father and mother and cleave to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. Now,
Wow.
I suggest that Adam isn't saying, the man will move in with his mother and father-in-law. I think that Adam was prophesying who will pursue who. And he begins to do what he did to the animals. He begins to prophesy. He begins to co-create with God the woman. And he's saying the man will be the pursuer. The woman will be pursued. The woman was born to be adored. And he begins to prophesy about this other part of him. How many understand that it takes two to make one? That's what marriage means. It means to merge.
Whoa.
And God never counts women in a crowd after that. You'll notice when you get to the New Testament, he says there was 5,000 men. There was 3,000 men. Why doesn't God count a woman? Because he says the two become one.
Wow.
As a matter of fact, by the time you get to the Greek language, there is no word for woman by itself. In other words, the word woman and the word wife are the same. The word man and the word husband are the same. In other words, the Greeks saw that men were made to be husbands and women were made to be wives so much they only had one word for it.
Wow.
That's a good word right there.
That's a good word. Very good.
The word helper is used 19 times in the Old Testament. 3 times for a woman and 16 times for God. When God says, I want to make a helper, he's not saying a slave. He's saying, I want someone to be like you, like me to you, Adam. I'm going to make someone who's like me to you.
Awesome. Wow. So good.
As a matter of fact, the theme, look at Ephesians chapter 5, verse 31. I'm just going to go quickly. For this reason, Paul's quoting, obviously, the Old Testament. For this reason, a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. Listen to this, verse 32. This mystery is great, but I'm speaking with reference to Christ and the church. In other words, God's saying, the way the two become one, the way I took Adam and I broke him in half so he could actually have somebody to yada with, Y-A-D-A, and Adam knew Eve, and they conceived. God isn't saying Adam had sex with Eve and they had children. The Bible assumes you knew that. There's a different word for intercourse in the Old Testament in Hebrew.
Wow.
But God uses the word Y-A-D-A, which means to intimately know you.
Beautiful.
And God says, Adam knew Eve. He didn't just have sex with her, he intimately knew her.
Wow.
Into me you see. He intimately knew her. And out of that intimacy, not just out of sexuality, but out of the intimacy, she had children.
Yes. Wow.
And then God says, I knew Adam.
Wow.
I was intimate the same way Adam was intimate with Eve.
Wow.
He's not talking about sex. The way that Adam and Eve, the way they conceived children through the yada, God goes, and I know Adam.
Wow.
In other words, I'd like to suggest that when God created a woman, he created somebody that's like God to him. She's not God. I'm saying
it's good.
Adam was not by himself. He was alone. And God goes, when I'm not in the garden, you have this big hole. I'm going to give you somebody that meets your need the same way I do, because you have a God hole. You're not complete without me. And now I'll take you and I'll break you in half. And now you need her the same way you need me.
Yeah.
And then I'll use it in the New Testament to relate to how I relate to my church. You need me the same way you need her.
Wow. Come on.
And how many understand that she was taken from his side? And by the way, the word rib there is translated side chamber. 5 other times in the Old Testament. In other words, I'd suggest that he didn't take a bone. He took the side chamber called woman out. And men, God formed man. Formed. It's a Hebrew word that's like formed. But he fashioned a woman.
So good. Wow. Like that.
That's a good word.
That is so good.
In fact, you're so made to be married that First Corinthians chapter 7 says that if God, and Paul said, I'd rather that you be single. Remember, the church was being persecuted when Paul said that, so let's be contextual about it.
Yeah.
I'd rather you be single, but each man has his own gift from God. The word gift there is actually the word charisma, the same word we get our word for supernatural gifts. In other words, it takes a supernatural gift to be single your whole life because you were created. You only have a person without the man, without the woman. Like you were actually created to be whole.
Wow.
To be... I don't know if that's good news or bad news for some people. I'm only half a person. That's what's wrong with me. True. Sorry. It is true. I think that you need a special gift to be single. I think God will give it to you, but I think you need a special gift to be single.
Right.
Have you ever wondered why the devil hates you? Have you ever what? Like, I'll leave you alone, you leave me alone. Have you ever thought about why God put the devil on the same planet? Like, there's lots of room. You look around,
The universe.
I mean, Mars would be good. You know, the sun would be better.
Yes.
Seriously. Remember when, before he was called Satan, he was called Lucifer. Obviously, it means beautiful light bearer. He's described as the most beautiful creature God ever made. He's in heaven. Most theologians think that he was one of three archangels, Gabriel, Michael, and Lucifer. And many think that Lucifer led worship around the throne because Isaiah says that in Lucifer's body were instruments of worship. And so when he fell, how did he fall? He fell by saying to God, I will be like God. I will rise up among the assembly of God, and I will be like God. And God said, no, you won't. You will be thrust down. You will be thrust down. You will be cast out and thrust down to the earth. So, what did the devil want? He wanted to be like God. I have this picture in my mind that he's thrust down to a planet, and Genesis chapter 1, verse 1, it says, and the earth was formless and void. The Hebrew word for chaos. In other words, it's just a rock floating through space. When Satan was thrown down to the earth, it was just a rock floating through space. Much like Mars. No water, no beauty, no life, just a rock floating through space. Who knows even if he's on the planet for a year or billions of years? We don't know. But at some point, he hears God say, let us, he says, let there be light. And he begins to see light. And then he begins to, and you get the idea for the sake of time, he begins to see 5 days of creation. And I think in my mind, if I'm Lucifer, I'm thinking, well, maybe God relented. Because all of a sudden he sees this rock that he was cast down to, just floating through space, and suddenly Satan is living in this beautiful garden. And then he hears these terrible words, let us make man in our image and our likeness. What did the devil want? He wanted to be like God.
Oh.
Why does he hate you? Because you have what he wanted.
Wow.
And by the way, the devil was not put on the earth to torment you. You were put on the earth to torment him.
Yes. Yeah.